For more than half a century she existed only as a question. On a hot summer day in 1971, two young men riding motorcycles through a quiet wooded area in Maryland stumbled upon a horrifying scene. A woman lay barely alive in a secluded field. She had no identification, no witnesses to speak for her, and no way to tell investigators who she was. Everything about her seemed to vanish into silence. Police searched desperately for answers. Fingerprints led nowhere. Missing person reports offered no match. Sketches were released to the public, but nobody came forward. Weeks turned into months. Months became years. Then the woman died. Her death was ruled a homicide, but without a name, the investigation slowly faded into the shadows. She became known only as Jane Doe, another unsolved mystery locked away inside aging evidence boxes. Yet hidden beneath this tragedy was a second story, one no investigator could have imagined. A story involving 3 children, a shattered family, decades of separation, and a secret buried for nearly 60 years. And the key to unlocking it all was waiting where nobody thought to look. Long before she became an unidentified homicide victim, she was a mother. The investigators didn't know it yet, but somewhere in the forgotten corners of America, 3 children had spent most of their lives carrying invisible scars connected to the same woman lying nameless in a Maryland morgue. Their names were Charles, Marie, and Judith. What happened to them would shape every year that followed. Sometime during the early 1950s, the 3 siblings were separated from the life they once knew and placed into institutional care. They were all very young, so young that most memories of their parents would eventually disappear. Faces faded. Voices vanished. Even simple details became impossible to recall. But one thing never disappeared: each other. Charles and Marie clung to one another through a childhood marked by instability, fear, and uncertainty. They entered foster care together, believing that as long as they remained side by side, they could survive whatever came next. What came next was far from the safe haven they had hoped for. The foster home they entered became a place neither sibling would ever forget. Years later, both would describe abuse, neglect, and hunger. Meals were scarce. Comfort was non-existent. The woods surrounding the property became their refuge from a world that seemed determined to forget them. And as the years passed, the bond between brother and sister grew stronger than anything else they possessed. Because when everything else was taken away, they still had each other. At least for a while. As the siblings grew older, survival began pulling them in different directions. Charles learned early that nobody was coming to rescue them. The abuse, the uncertainty, and the feeling of being trapped pushed him toward a decision that would change everything. Again and again he ran away. Sometimes he disappeared into nearby woods. Other times he simply vanished for days, determined to find a better life somewhere beyond the institutions that had failed him. Marie always worried when he left. She was frightened of what might happen if she followed him, yet every time he disappeared, she hoped he would return. And somehow he usually did. Until one day he didn't. As teenagers, their paths slowly separated. Marie was eventually helped by a compassionate caseworker who arranged a small apartment where she could begin building an independent life. For the first time, she had a chance at stability. Then Charles found her again. For a brief period, it seemed the 2 siblings might finally remain together. But history intervened. Charles enlisted in the military. When he left, neither of them could know that it would become the last time they would see each other for more than 6 decades. Letters stopped. Addresses changed. Years passed. Then decades. Marie waited for her brother to come back, just as he always had before. But this time there was only silence. Meanwhile, Charles returned from military service carrying memories he preferred not to revisit. The past became something he buried deep inside himself. And somewhere far away, completely unknown to both of them, the fate of their missing mother was already becoming one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries. While Charles and Marie struggled to rebuild their lives, the woman investigators called Jane Doe remained trapped inside an unfinished story. Years turned into decades. The original detectives retired. Files were boxed away. Leads disappeared. Witnesses died. Every passing year made the possibility of identifying her seem less likely. By the time the 21st century arrived, the case appeared almost impossible to solve. Yet one stubborn fact refused to disappear. Someone had known this woman. Someone had given her a name. Someone somewhere had once loved her. In 2019, nearly half a century after the crime, a Maryland cold case investigator named Wade Zufall began reviewing the department's oldest unsolved files. Among them sat the 1971 Jane Doe case, the oldest cold case in the agency's history. Most investigators would have seen a dead end. Zufall saw a possibility. The problem was obvious. There was almost nothing left. No easy DNA sample. No surviving witnesses. No obvious suspect. On a scale of solvability, the case barely registered. Then, while examining the remaining evidence, Zufall discovered something unusual. Hidden among decades-old records were preserved histology slides created during the original autopsy. Tiny samples of tissue had survived the passage of time, forgotten inside storage archives for more than 50 years. To most people they looked insignificant. But to investigators desperate for answers, they represented something extraordinary. A final chance. Because if modern science could recover DNA from those fragile slides, the woman without a name might finally tell investigators who she was. And once that door opened, an entirely different mystery would begin to emerge. For more than 50 years, the woman had remained silent. Now, investigators were about to ask science to do something that once seemed impossible: recover a genetic identity from tissue preserved on microscopic slides since 1971. The challenge was enormous. Time is rarely kind to biological evidence. Decades of storage, chemical treatments, and natural degradation often destroy the very information investigators need. Yet advances in forensic genetics had transformed what was once considered unusable evidence into a potential breakthrough. The slides were sent to Othram, a laboratory specializing in identifying unknown individuals through advanced DNA analysis. Scientists carefully removed tiny amounts of preserved tissue and began an incredibly delicate process. Cells were broken apart. Genetic material was extracted. Every step carried risk. If the DNA was too damaged, the effort could end before it truly began. Then came the news investigators had hoped for. Against the odds, the laboratory successfully recovered a full DNA profile. For the first time since the woman had been found in that Maryland field, there was a path forward. The profile contained hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, enough to begin searching for relatives who might unknowingly hold the key to her identity. The profile was uploaded into genealogical databases used for law enforcement investigations. Then everyone waited. Hours became days. Days became weeks. And eventually the results started appearing. The unidentified woman was connected to a living man. A man named Charles Shy. At first, investigators assumed he might be a distant cousin. But the truth hidden inside those genetic markers was far more powerful than anyone expected. When investigators saw the name Charles Shy appear in the genetic results, they believed they had found a relative of the unidentified woman. Maybe a cousin. Maybe a distant family connection. What they did not expect was that Charles himself had spent most of his life searching for answers without realizing it. Detective Wade Zufall tracked him to Ohio and made the call. It did not go well. Charles, known to friends and family as Chuck, immediately assumed it was a scam. A stranger claiming to be a detective was talking about a decades-old homicide and suggesting there might be a family connection. He hung up. Twice. Only after speaking with his wife did Chuck decide to call back. As the conversation continued, the detective asked a simple but important question. Had anyone in his family ever disappeared and never been heard from again? The question opened a door Chuck had kept closed for decades. He explained that he and his sisters had been placed in an orphanage when they were children. He remembered very little about his parents. In fact, the only detail he could confidently provide was that he believed his mother's first name had been Sarah. That single clue was enough to move forward. Chuck agreed to submit a DNA sample. Scientists compared his profile to the DNA recovered from the unidentified woman. Then the results arrived. The numbers were so strong that there was no room for doubt. This was not a distant relative. This was not a cousin. The woman found dying in a Maryland field in 1971 was Charles Shy's mother. After 54 years, Jane Doe finally had a name. Sarah Bell Shy. And the discovery was about to reveal an even deeper mystery. The identification of Sarah Bell Shy answered one question. But it created many more. Who was she? What had happened to her after her children disappeared into the foster care system? And perhaps most painfully of all, had she abandoned them or had something else happened? Detective Zufall began digging through every record he could find. Decades-old documents, public databases, historical records, and forgotten fragments of information slowly started forming a picture of Sarah's life. For Chuck, the news was difficult to process. He had spent a lifetime without a mother. The woman whose DNA had just identified her was, in many ways, a stranger. There was sadness, curiosity, confusion, and 1,000 unanswered questions all mixed together. Yet amid the uncertainty, one realization became impossible to ignore. If Sarah had been identified through her children, then perhaps not all of her children were gone. Chuck remembered two sisters, Marie and Judith. He had not seen either one in decades. The youngest sister, Judith, seemed especially difficult to trace. Records were fragmented. Names had changed. Entire portions of the family's history had vanished into time. But Detective Zufall refused to stop. The case was no longer just about identifying a homicide victim. It had become something larger. A family separated by tragedy was beginning to reappear, piece by piece. And somewhere, investigators believed that one of Chuck's sisters might still be alive. The challenge now was finding her before time ran out. Finding Marie proved far more difficult than identifying Sarah. More than 60 years had passed since she had last seen her brother. Names had changed. Addresses had changed. Entire lives had been lived. And with every passing year, the odds of a reunion grew smaller. Detective Zufall followed every lead he could find. Eventually, he located a woman in Illinois whose birth date matched what investigators were searching for. But when he called, there was no answer. No return call. Another dead end. Or so it seemed. Refusing to give up, he found her daughter Lynn. The detective knew the conversation would sound unbelievable. He carefully explained that he was investigating a decades-old homicide and believed he had uncovered something important about her family. Together they arranged a three-way call. When Marie finally answered, everything changed. The detective explained that investigators had identified her mother. Then he revealed something even more extraordinary. Her brother was alive. For a moment, it was almost too much to comprehend. Marie had spent decades believing she would never see Charles again. Her daughters had searched for him years earlier, writing letters and following every lead they could find. Nothing had worked. Eventually, hope faded, and Charles became almost like a ghost from another life. Now, suddenly, that ghost had a voice, a phone number, a heartbeat. And for the first time in more than 60 years, the brother and sister who had survived so much together were preparing to speak again. When Charles and Marie finally reconnected, the reunion was emotional beyond words. The moment they spoke, decades seemed to disappear. The memories came rushing back, not of orphanages, foster homes, or hardship, but of the one thing that had helped them survive it all, each other. For 60 years, both had carried the same question. Why had their mother disappeared? Why had they been left behind? Why had their family fallen apart? The identification of Sarah Bell Shy did not provide every answer, but it revealed a truth that changed how they viewed their past. For years they had assumed abandonment. Now they knew something important. Sarah's story had not ended when her children entered care. She had continued living her life. And in 1971, she became the victim of a violent crime that remains unsolved to this day. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. Instead of seeing only the absence of a mother, Charles and Marie were forced to confront the possibility that much of her life remained unknown. What struggles had she faced? What circumstances led her to Maryland? What happened during those final days? Nobody could say for certain. Even Detective Zufall acknowledged that the family might never know every detail. The woman they spent decades wondering about had been silenced before she could explain her choices herself. But one revelation stood above all the others. The DNA had uncovered far more than a name. It had reunited a brother and sister who believed they had lost each other forever. And after 60 years of searching, waiting, and wondering, they finally had their family back. The reunion took place more than 60 years after Charles and Marie had last stood together. No investigator could have predicted what would happen next. When they finally met face to face, there was no awkwardness, no distance, no need to explain the decades that had passed between them. The connection was immediate, as if the years had simply folded away. They laughed, they cried, they remembered, and for the first time since childhood, they no longer had to wonder whether the other was still out there. For Charles, the change was profound. The sister he thought he had lost forever was suddenly back in his life. They began talking almost every day, sharing stories, memories, and pieces of a family history that had been scattered across generations. Marie described a feeling she had not experienced in decades: safety. A sense that a missing part of her life had finally returned. There was also sadness. Investigators discovered that their younger sister Judith had passed away in 2021 before the family could be reunited. Yet even then, Detective Zufall worked to ensure that all three siblings would be connected again in some way. The murder of Sarah Bell Shy remains unsolved. The person responsible has never been identified. But this story is no longer only about a homicide. It is about identity. It is about perseverance. It is about the extraordinary power of science to restore names, histories, and human connections long thought lost forever. For decades, Sarah Bell Shy was known only as Jane Doe. Today she has her name back. And because of that, two siblings found each other again before it was too late. Sometimes justice begins with a question. And sometimes, after 60 years, that question finally receives an answer. If stories like Sarah's remind us of anything, it's that every unidentified victim was once a person with a family, a history, and people who still deserve answers.